Evermeres True Light, Washington, D.C., 1922. Margaret Calloway had thrown James Calloway's engagement ring into the Potomac the day she learned he had died. But now, 3 years later, she found it on her doorstep, polished and gleaming. And beneath it a note. I never left you. Chapter 1. The Echo of a Promise. The chill October air bit at Margaret Calloway's cheeks as she walked along the tidal basin, the skeletal branches of the cherry trees reaching out like accusing fingers. It was a familiar route, one she'd walked countless times before, both with James and without. But today, the familiar scenery felt alien, distorted by the impossible event that had shattered the fragile peace she'd painstakingly built over the last 3 years. The ring. It sat heavy in her coat pocket, a cold, hard weight against her thigh. It shouldn't exist. She had hurled it, with all the force of her grief and rage, into the murky depths of the Potomac on that bleak November day in 1919. The day the telegram arrived, stark and cruel in its brevity, regret to inform you Lieutenant James Calloway killed in action, she had watched the silver band, a simple circle of platinum with a single, flawless diamond, arc through the air and disappear beneath the water's surface. It was a symbolic burial, a desperate attempt to sever the last tie to a future that had been ripped away from her. A future filled with whispered promises, stolen kisses, and the quiet joy of building a life together. Now, 3 years later, it was back. Found on her doorstep that morning, nestled in a small, velvet-lined box, gleaming as if it had never been touched by the river's cold embrace. And beneath it, the note. I never left you. Her breath hitched in her throat. The handwriting was undeniably James's. The familiar, slightly slanted script she'd traced countless times on the letters he'd sent from the front. Letters filled with longing, with stories of camaraderie and fear, with the unwavering certainty that he would return to her. The letters had stopped abruptly in October 1918, a month before the armistice. A month before the world celebrated the end of the Great War, a celebration that had tasted like ashes in Margaret's mouth. She stopped walking, her gaze fixed on the rippling surface of the water. The sun, a pale disk in the autumn sky, cast a shimmering path across the basin. It was beautiful, deceptively so. Just like the ring. Beautiful and utterly terrifying. Could it be true? Could James somehow have survived? The War Department had been unequivocal. There had been witnesses, they said.
A shell.
A direct hit.
No survivors.
She had even received a small, wooden box containing his personal effects, a worn leather-bound journal, a silver locket holding her picture, a tarnished Street Christopher medal. All tangible reminders of a life extinguished. Margaret closed her eyes, the image of James's face, youthful and vibrant, flashing behind her eyelids. His laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the warmth of his hand in hers. Memories, once a source of comfort, now felt like shards of glass piercing her heart. She opened her eyes again, her gaze drawn to the Washington Monument, its imposing form a stark reminder of the city's power and the war's enduring legacy. Washington, D.C. had become her refuge, a place where she could lose herself in the anonymity of the bustling crowds, in the endless stream of government work. She had taken a position as a typist at the War Department, ironically enough. The rhythmic clatter of the typewriter keys, the mundane routine, had been a balm to her wounded soul. She had learned to live with the grief, to carry it like a heavy stone in her pocket. It was a part of her now, an indelible mark of the war that had stolen so much. She had even, tentatively, started to consider a future. A quiet, unremarkable future, perhaps with Mr. Henderson, a kind, if somewhat dull, accountant from her church. He was nothing like James, of course, but he was steady, reliable,
safe.
The ring and the note had shattered that fragile sense of security. It had reopened the wound, raw and bleeding. Margaret pulled the ring from her pocket, the diamond catching the sunlight and flashing with an almost mocking brilliance. She turned it over in her hand, examining the inscription on the inside, "Forever yours, JC, it was a promise whispered in the quiet darkness of a summer night, a promise sealed with a kiss beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the water, sending a spray of icy droplets against her face. She shivered, not entirely from the cold. The note. I never left you. It implied so much, hinted at a story so improbable, so impossible, that she almost dismissed it as a cruel hoax. But the handwriting and the ring itself, she looked up, scanning the faces of the people passing by. Could he be here, watching her? After all this time? The thought sent a jolt of fear and a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. A dangerous, treacherous hope. A man bumped into her, muttering an apology. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of a fedora. He carried a worn leather briefcase, and his coat, though well-made, showed signs of wear. There was something familiar about his gait, the way he held himself, but he was gone before she could get a proper look. Margaret clutched the ring tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. The city, once a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth, filled with hidden corners and unseen eyes. She had to know the truth. She had to find out who had left the ring and why. Even if the truth was more painful than the lies she had been living. Even if it meant confronting the ghost of a promise made and seemingly broken years ago. The wind carried a whisper, so faint she almost didn't hear it. Or maybe she imagined it. A whisper that sounded like her name. Chapter 2. Ghosts in the Water. The water of the Potomac seemed darker now, the playful ripples replaced by a somber, almost menacing swell. Margaret stared into its depths, the polished ring still clutched tightly in her gloved hand. It felt colder now, the initial shock giving way to a creeping unease. Was this a message from beyond the grave? Or something far more earthly and potentially more dangerous? She retraced her steps, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The walk back to her small apartment on K Street felt longer than usual, each passing face a potential suspect, each shadow a hiding place. The city, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien and threatening. Once inside, she locked the door, the bolt sliding home with a decisive click. The apartment was small, a single room with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom, but it had been her haven. The faded floral wallpaper, the worn rug, the chipped porcelain teacup, she always used these were the anchors of her new life, the remnants of normalcy she had clung to. She placed the ring and the note on the small, round table that served as both her dining and writing space. The velvet box seemed out of place amidst the stacks of papers and the half-finished letter to her sister, Eleanor. Eleanor, ever practical, had urged her to move on, to accept James's death and embrace the opportunities that life, even a life scarred by war, still offered. Margaret had tried. She really had. But the memory of James, the intensity of their love, had been a constant presence, a shadow that followed her everywhere. She picked up the note again, turning it over in her hands. The paper was thick, creamy, the kind used for formal invitations or important documents. Not the kind of paper a soldier would have carried in the trenches. This was a deliberate act, a carefully crafted message. She examined the handwriting again, comparing it to the last letter she had received from James, a letter she kept tucked away in a small, cedar box along with his other belongings. The cedar box was her Pandora's box, filled with both cherished memories and unbearable pain. She rarely opened it. The handwriting was identical. The same slant, the same flourish on the J, the same slight pressure on the downstrokes. It was James's hand, without a doubt. But how? Margaret sank into the worn armchair by the window, her mind racing. Could it be a forgery? Someone who knew James, someone who had access to his letters? But who would do such a thing, and why? She thought of the man who had bumped into her near the tidal basin. The tall man with the fedora and the worn briefcase. Had he been watching her? Had he placed the ring on her doorstep? She remembered the witnesses, the reports from the War Department. They had been so certain. James had been leading a charge, they said. A shell had exploded directly in front of him. There was nothing left. Tears welled up in her eyes, hot and stinging. She had grieved for him, mourned him, built a wall around her heart to protect herself from ever feeling that kind of pain again.
And now this.
This cruel, impossible hope. She stood up, pacing the small room, her agitation growing. She needed to talk to someone, to share this burden with someone who might understand. But who? Mr. Henderson? He would think she was losing her mind. Eleanor? She would tell her to throw the ring back into the river and forget about it. There was one person, though. One person who had known James, who had served with him in France. Captain Alistair Davies. He had been James's commanding officer and a friend. He had been the one to deliver the news of James's death to her, his face etched with grief and a quiet understanding that had offered a small measure of comfort in those dark days. Alistair had stayed in Washington after the war, taking a position at the Bureau of Investigation. He was a man of secrets, a man who understood the shadows that lurked beneath the surface of polite society. He might be able to help her. She found his address in the city directory, a small, neat entry on a quiet street in Georgetown. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the telephone. Was she ready to open this door, to step into the unknown? The ring, cold and heavy in her pocket, seemed to pulse with a silent energy. It was a summons, a call from the past. She couldn't ignore it. She picked up the receiver, her hand trembling slightly. She gave the operator Alistair's number, her voice a shaky whisper. As the phone rang, she closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever lay ahead. The ringing stopped, and a gruff voice answered.
Davies here.
Alistair? It's Margaret. Margaret Calloway. There was a pause, a moment of stunned silence. Then his voice, softer now, tinged with surprise and a hint of something else concern. Margaret? Is that really you? What's wrong? She took a deep breath. It's about James, she said, the words catching in her throat. Another silence, and she pictured him on the other end, surprised, maybe even suspicious. Margaret, he finally said, his voice low. What about him? The dam broke. The words poured out of her, a torrent of grief, confusion, and desperate hope. She told him about the ring, the note, the impossible possibility that James might still be alive. She told him, and before she finished, she heard a door slam shut on the other end and knew he was coming. Chapter 3. The Unsent Letters. Alistair arrived within the hour, his face etched with a concern that mirrored her own turmoil. He hadn't changed much in the intervening years. Still tall and lean, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper, etched by time and the burdens he carried. But his eyes, a clear, penetrating blue, still held the same intelligence and quiet strength that she remembered. He listened patiently as she recounted the morning's events, his gaze fixed on the ring and the note laid out on the table. He examined them carefully, turning the ring over in his hand, scrutinizing the inscription, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's his handwriting, Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sure of it. Alistair nodded slowly. It certainly appears to be. But it's impossible, Margaret. I saw what happened. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She had known, intellectually, that James was gone. But hearing Alistair confirm it, hearing the pain in his voice, brought the reality crashing down on her again. But the ring, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. How could it be here? I threw it into the river. Alistair sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. There are things that happened during the war, things that were never fully explained. Secrets, Margaret. Secrets that were buried deep. He looked at her, his gaze intense. The War Department's report was definitive. But reports can be manipulated. Witnesses can be silenced. Or mistaken. A flicker of hope, dangerous and fragile, ignited within her. You think it's possible he survived? Alistair hesitated. I don't want to give you false hope, Margaret. But I can't dismiss this entirely. Not without investigating. He picked up the note again. This paper is high quality. Not the sort of thing a soldier would have had access to in the trenches. This was written after the war, likely here in Washington. The man, Margaret said, remembering the encounter near the tidal basin. The man who bumped into me. He was tall, wearing a fedora. I couldn't see his face clearly, but you felt something? Alistair finished, his gaze knowing. A sense of familiarity. She nodded. It was his gait, the way he carried himself. It reminded me of James. Alistair leaned forward, his voice low. We need to be careful, Margaret. If James is alive, and if he's been hiding all this time, there's a reason. A very good reason. And whoever sent this ring, whoever wrote this note, may have their own agenda. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. There were things James was involved in during the war. Things I can't talk about, even now. Sensitive intelligence, work. He was recruited for a special unit. They dealt with delicate matters. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known that James's service was more than just the official reports. He had hinted at it in his letters, veiled references to missions, to dangers he couldn't fully disclose. What kind of matters? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair shook his head. I can't say. But it's possible that his work put him in danger. From the enemy, yes, but also from our own side. The implication was chilling. Betrayal. Double-dealing. The murky world of espionage, where loyalty was a shifting concept and truth was a dangerous commodity. So what do we do? Margaret asked, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Alistair smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We investigate. Quietly. Carefully. We start by finding out everything we can about the ring. Where it was made, who might have purchased it, and we try to identify the man you saw. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I have contacts. Resources. I can make inquiries. He paused, his gaze lingering on her face. But we need to be discreet. If James is alive, and if he's in hiding, he may be in danger. And we don't want to do anything that might put him, or you, at risk. He closed the notebook, his expression serious. There's something else, Margaret. Something I haven't told you. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the cedar box she had pointed out earlier. After I reported his death, I received a package. It was addressed to him in his handwriting. I never opened it. I couldn't bring myself to. It's been sitting in my safe ever since. Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. A package? From James? Alistair nodded. It's possible that it contains some answers. Or at least some clues. He stood up, his movements purposeful. I'll go get it. And Margaret, he looked at her, and she saw a flicker of the young officer who had befriended James so long ago. Be careful. Trust no one. He turned and left, and the slam of the door, so like the last time he was here, left her shaken. What were in those letters? And would she ever be ready to hear them? Chapter 4. Whispers of Treachery. The wait for Alistair felt like an eternity. Margaret paced the confines of her small apartment, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a relic from her childhood home. Each tick seemed to echo the relentless beat of her heart, a drumbeat of anxiety and anticipation. She tried to distract herself, tidying the already spotless room, straightening the framed photographs on the mantelpiece. There was a picture of her parents, smiling and stiff in their formal attire. A picture of her and Eleanor, taken just before the war, their faces young and carefree. And a picture of James, in his uniform, his eyes sparkling with mischief and a hint of the steel that lay beneath. She picked up the photograph of James, tracing the outline of his face with her fingertip. It was a face she knew so intimately, a face that had haunted her dreams for the past 3 years. Could that face, that smile, be hiding a secret, a life she knew nothing about? The thought was unsettling, a betrayal of the memory she had cherished. But Alistair's words, his veiled warnings, had planted a seed of doubt, a suspicion that the James she knew, the James she had loved, might have been a more complex, more enigmatic figure than she had ever imagined. The sound of a car pulling up outside startled her. She rushed to the window, peering through the curtains. It was Alistair, his face grim, his movements hurried. He carried a small, metal box under his arm, its surface dull and scratched. The package. She opened the door before he could knock, her heart pounding in her chest. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small room, bringing with it a sense of urgency and a hint of danger. "I have it," he said, his voice low. He placed the box on the table, next to the ring and the note. Margaret stared at the box, her breath catching in her throat. It was smaller than she had expected, about the size of a shoebox. The metal was cold and unyielding, the lock securely fastened. "Do you have the key?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alistair shook his head.
No.
It was sent without a key. I suspect it's a special kind of lock. One that requires a specific technique to open." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "I know someone who might be able to help. A former colleague. He's discreet. And he owes me a favor." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "His name is Silas Blackwood. He works as a locksmith, but he has other skills. Skills he acquired during the war." He handed her the paper. "Go to this address. Tell him I sent you. Tell him it's about Project Nightingale." Margaret took the paper, her fingers brushing against his. The name Project Nightingale sent a shiver down her spine. It sounded ominous, secretive, like something out of a spy novel. "What is Project Nightingale?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair hesitated. It was a highly classified operation. James was involved. "I can't tell you any more than that. It's still sensitive." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Just go to Blackwood. Show him the box. And tell him what I said. He'll know what to do." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "And Margaret, be careful. This is a dangerous path we're on. There are people who would want this box to remain unopened. People who would go to great lengths to protect their secrets." He turned to leave, but then stopped, turning back to face her. "One more thing. I've been doing some digging. About the ring." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What did you find?" Alistair's face was grim. "It's a unique design. Not something you'd find in a typical jewelry store. It was made by a specialist. A jeweler who caters to a very select clientele. The kind of clientele that values discretion above all else." "And?" Margaret prompted, her voice filled with a growing sense of unease. Alistair's gaze met hers, his eyes dark and troubled. "The jeweler, he disappeared. Shortly after the war. Vanished without a trace." The words sank and the clock ticked. She felt the pull again, the one that drew her to the ring, to the river, and whatever else lay beneath. "He'd disappeared?" she repeated, dumbly. Alistair nodded, as if he never existed. He said and left, leaving her standing with a metal box of secrets and a growing knot of terror that threatened to unravel everything she had held so dear. Chapter 5. A face in the crowd. Silas Blackwood's shop was tucked away in a narrow alley off Pennsylvania Avenue, a nondescript storefront with a single, dusty window displaying a collection of antique locks and keys. The air hummed with the low thrum of city noise, a constant backdrop of car horns, rumbling engines, and distant voices. But here, in this forgotten corner, a sense of quiet isolation prevailed. Margaret hesitated before entering, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The metal box, tucked securely under her arm, felt heavy and ominous. Alistair's warning echoed in her mind. "Be careful. This is a dangerous path we're on." She took a deep breath and pushed open the door, a small bell jingling above her head. The shop was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of metal and oil. Shelves lined the walls, filled with a chaotic assortment of locks, keys, tools, and strange, unidentifiable objects. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that danced across the cluttered space. Behind a cluttered counter, a man sat hunched over a workbench, his back to the door. He was small and wiry, his head bald and gleaming in the dim light. He wore a pair of magnifying glasses perched on his nose, and his hands, gnarled and stained with years of working with metal, moved with a delicate precision. "Mr. Blackwood?" Margaret asked, her voice hesitant. The man didn't respond, seemingly absorbed in his work. She cleared her throat, speaking a little louder this time. Mr. Blackwood? My name is Margaret Calloway. Alastair Davies sent me. The man slowly turned, his movements deliberate. He removed his magnifying glasses, revealing eyes that were surprisingly sharp and piercing, a startling contrast to his otherwise unassuming appearance. They were the color of slate, cold, and assessing. Davies, you say? He said, his voice raspy, like sandpaper on metal. What does the good captain want? Margaret held out the metal box. He said you might be able to open this. He said to tell you it's about Project Nightingale. The man's eyes flickered, a momentary flicker of recognition, quickly masked by a carefully neutral expression. He took the box from her, his fingers tracing the edges, feeling the lock mechanism with a practiced touch. Project Nightingale, he murmured, his voice barely audible. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. He turned the box over in his hands, examining it from every angle. This is a special lock. Not something you'd find on a common strongbox. It's designed to resist tampering. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. Davies knows what he's asking, doesn't he? Opening this, it could have consequences. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. He said there might be danger. But he also said it might contain answers. About my fiancé. He was involved in Project Nightingale. The man's expression softened slightly, a flicker of empathy in his eyes. The war, it left its mark on all of us. Some scars are visible, others are hidden deep. He set the box down on the workbench, his hands hovering over it. I'll do what I can, but I can't make any promises. This locket's designed to be opened only once. And even then, only by someone who knows the secret. He reached for a set of tools, a collection of thin, delicate instruments that looked more like surgical implements than locksmith's tools. It will take time. And I'll need to concentrate. You can wait here if you like, but it might be a while. Margaret hesitated. The shop was cramped and unsettling, the air thick with a sense of hidden knowledge and unspoken secrets. But she couldn't leave. She had to know what was inside the box. I'll wait, she said, her voice firm. She found a small, rickety stool in a corner of the shop and sat down, watching as Silas Blackwood began his work. His movements were slow and deliberate, his concentration absolute. He seemed to enter a different world, a world of intricate mechanisms and hidden tumblers, a world where the slightest mistake could have dire consequences. As she waited, Margaret's thoughts drifted back to the man near the tidal basin. The man who had bumped into her, the man who had reminded her of James. She had tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, a trick of the light, a desperate longing for something that couldn't be. But the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that it wasn't just her imagination. There was something about his gait, the way he held his head, the fleeting glimpse she had caught of his profile. She pulled a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket, a sketch she had made after returning to her apartment. It was a rough drawing, a hasty attempt to capture the man's features. She had focused on the details she could remember. The shape of his jaw, the line of his nose, the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck. She studied the sketch, comparing it to the photograph of James on her mantelpiece. The resemblance was uncanny. Not exact, of course. The man in her sketch was older, his face more weathered, his hair streaked with gray. But the underlying structure, the bone structure, the set of his eyes, she looked up, her gaze drawn to the window. The street outside was bustling with activity, a constant stream of people passing by. She scanned the faces, searching, hoping, fearing. And then she saw him. Across the street, standing in the shadow of a building, was the man from her sketch. He was wearing the same fedora, the same worn coat. He was staring directly at the shop, his gaze fixed on her. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. She felt a surge of panic, a primal urge to flee. But she was frozen, trapped, her eyes locked with his. He was so much like James, older, changed, but the eyes were his. He held her gaze for a moment, a long, unsettling moment. Then, he gave a slight nod, a barely perceptible movement of his head. And then, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she didn't know if it was from fear or relief, or something else entirely. She glanced at Silas. He hadn't seen a thing. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Coil. Silas Blackwood worked with a painstaking precision that bordered on the obsessive. The only sounds in the small shop were the faint clicks and scrapes of his tools against the metal of the box, and the occasional soft curse muttered under his breath. Margaret watched him, mesmerized, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The encounter with the man outside, the chilling familiarity of his face, had left her shaken. Was it James? Or a ghost, conjured by her grief and desperate hope? After what seemed like an eternity, Silas finally straightened up, his face bathed in sweat, his hands trembling slightly. He let out a long, slow sigh. "It's done," he said, his voice raspy. "But be warned. This lock, it wasn't just designed to keep people out. It was designed to protect what's inside." He pushed the box towards her, his gaze lingering on her face. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once you open it, there's no going back." Margaret nodded, her throat dry. She reached for the box, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She hesitated for a moment, a wave of doubt washing over her. Was she ready for the truth? Whatever it might be. She took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The box was lined with dark velvet, a stark contrast to the harsh metal exterior. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded satin, lay a collection of letters, a small, leather-bound journal, and a single, tarnished photograph. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The letters were tied together with a faded ribbon, the handwriting on the top envelope undeniably James's. The journal was similar to the one she had received among his official effects, but this one was thicker, heavier, filled with pages of tightly written script. She picked up the photograph, her hand trembling. It was a picture of James, but not the James she knew. He was wearing civilian clothes, a dark suit and a fedora, his face partially obscured by shadow. He was standing in front of a building, a grand, imposing structure with ornate columns and a sweeping staircase. She didn't recognize the building. It looked European. Behind him, partially hidden in the shadows, stood another figure, a woman. Margaret couldn't see her face clearly, but she could make out the curve of her cheek, the sweep of her dark hair, the elegant line of her dress. Margaret felt a sudden chill, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Who was this woman? And why was James with her, in this clandestine photograph? She set the photograph aside and picked up the letters. She untied the ribbon, her fingers fumbling with the knot. The letters were dated, starting just a few months before his official death. She opened the first one, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter was addressed to someone named Isabel, not Margaret. "My dearest Isabel," it began. "I write to you under the cover of darkness, my heart heavy with secrets and longing. The mission progresses, but the dangers grow with each passing day. I fear that I may not see you again." Margaret's breath hitched in her throat. Isabel. Who was Isabel? And what mission was James talking about? She continued reading, her eyes scanning the words, her mind reeling. The letter was filled with expressions of love, of longing, of a deep and passionate connection. It was a love letter, but not to her. It was a love letter to another woman. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, as if the ring she still carried in her pocket had suddenly pierced her heart. She flipped through the other letters, skimming the contents. They were all the same. Letters of love, of devotion, of a shared secret life. Letters to Isabel. Margaret felt a sense of betrayal, a profound and devastating sense of loss. The James she had loved, the James she had mourned, was a stranger. A phantom. A lie. She closed the box, her hands shaking. She couldn't bear to look at the letters, at the photograph, at the evidence of his deception. Silas Blackwood was watching her, his expression filled with a quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "Sometimes the truth is more painful than the lies we tell ourselves." Margaret stood up, her legs shaky. She felt numb, disoriented, as if the world had shifted on its axis. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, for opening the box. She turned to leave, clutching the box to her chest, her mind racing. She had to get out of there, out of the suffocating confines of the shop, out into the open air, where she could breathe, where she could think. As she stepped out onto the street, she saw him again. The man. He was standing across the street, leaning against a lamppost, watching her. He was no longer wearing the fedora, and his face was clearly visible. It was James. Older, more weathered, his hair streaked with gray. But it was undeniably him. He gave her a slow, sad smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He raised his hand, a silent gesture of greeting, or perhaps farewell. And she was still staring, in complete shock, when a car, black, sleek and moving with frightening speed, screeched around the corner, heading straight for him. It happened so fast, she didn't realize what was happening. Until it was too late. Chapter 7. Beneath the cherry blossoms. The world seemed to slow to a crawl, the screech of tires, the sickening thud, the horrified screams of bystanders, all blending into a distorted, nightmarish cacophony. Margaret stood frozen, the metal box clutched to her chest, her mind struggling to process the scene unfolding before her. The black car, its engine roaring, didn't stop. It sped away, disappearing around the corner as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a scene of chaos and devastation. Margaret's legs finally unfroze, propelled by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate, primal fear. She ran towards the spot where it had to be James, had been standing. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. Someone was shouting for a doctor, another was trying to clear a path, their voices a jumble of panicked sounds. Margaret pushed her way through the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She saw him then, lying on the pavement, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. It was James. No doubt remained. The face, though bruised and bloodied, was the face she had loved, the face that had haunted her dreams. But it was a face devoid of life, a mask of stillness where once there had been vibrant energy and a mischievous smile. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him, afraid to confirm the reality of what she was seeing. A wave of grief, so intense, so overwhelming, washed over her, threatening to drown her. Someone gently pulled her away, a kind-faced woman with tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's gone, dear," she said softly. "There's nothing you can do." Margaret shook her head, her mind refusing to accept the words. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be. It can't be." But it was. James was gone. Again. This time, not in the distant, muddy fields of France, but here, in the heart of Washington, on a busy street, in broad daylight. The police arrived, their sirens wailing, their presence bringing a semblance of order to the chaos. They questioned witnesses, took measurements, their movements efficient and detached. Margaret watched them, numb, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. She saw Alistair then, pushing his way through the crowd, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He saw her, kneeling on the pavement, her clothes stained with blood, her face streaked with tears. He rushed to her side, his voice rough with emotion. "Margaret, what happened? Is it him?" She nodded, unable to speak, the tears flowing freely now. Alistair knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders, offering a silent comfort. "I saw him," she finally managed to say, her voice choked with sobs. He was standing there, and then a car came out of nowhere. Alistair's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "A black car? Did you see the license plate?" Margaret shook her head. "It happened too fast. I didn't see anything." Alistair stood up, his gaze sweeping the scene, his mind already working, piecing together the fragments of information. He spoke to the police officers, his voice authoritative, his questions sharp and precise. Margaret watched him, her mind slowly starting to clear, the initial shock giving way to a growing sense of anger, of outrage. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. Someone had deliberately run James down, someone who had known he was alive, someone who had wanted him dead. The metal box, still clutched in her arms, felt heavy and cold. The secrets it contained, the letters to Isabel, the photograph, they were no longer just a source of personal betrayal. They were clues, pieces of a puzzle that might lead to James's killer. Alistair returned to her side, his face grim. "They're taking him to the morgue," he said softly. "I'll go with them. You should go home. Get some rest." Margaret shook her head.
No.
"I'm going with you." Alistair hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "Margaret, it won't be easy." Seeing him like this, she met his gaze, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I need to see him. I need to say goodbye." He nodded, understanding. He helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her as they walked towards the waiting ambulance. Later, after the grim formalities at the morgue, after the endless questions from the police, Alistair drove Margaret back to her apartment. The city lights blurred past, a hazy kaleidoscope of color, reflecting the turmoil in her mind. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the hum of the engine. Finally, Alistair spoke, his voice low. "The cherry blossoms," he said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "He always loved the cherry blossoms." Margaret looked at him, surprised. "James? He never mentioned them."
Alistair smiled, a faint, sad smile. "He wouldn't have."
"Not to you." It was something he shared with Isabel. Margaret felt a fresh pang of grief, a sharp reminder of the life James had lived, the life she had never known. "He used to take her to see them," Alistair continued. "Every spring. It was their special place." He looked over to the tidal basin, the bare trees stark against the city lights. He sighed, and in a whisper so low she barely heard, he added, "He was supposed to meet her there, you know."
Today.
Chapter 8. The Price of Silence. The apartment felt cold and empty, the silence deafening after the cacophony of the day's events. Margaret stood by the window, staring out at the night sky, the city lights a distant, blurred shimmer. The metal box sat on the table, a silent testament to the shattered illusions and the brutal reality that had replaced them. Alistair had left hours ago, promising to continue his investigation, to uncover the truth behind James's death, his second death. He had warned her again to be careful, to trust no one. The world, it seemed, was a far more dangerous place than she had ever imagined. She picked up the box, her fingers tracing the cold metal. She had to know more. She had to understand the life James had lived, the secrets he had kept, the woman he had loved. She had to understand why he had been killed. She opened the box again, the letters to Isabel spread out before her. She had read the first one, the one that had shattered her heart, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to read the others. Now, she forced herself to pick them up, to delve into the world of James and Isabel, a world that had existed parallel to her own, hidden beneath the surface of his carefully constructed facade. The letters were arranged chronologically, spanning a period of several months, from the early days of their relationship to the final, desperate missive written just days before James's official death. They painted a picture of a passionate, intense love affair, a connection forged in the crucible of war and secrecy. Isabel, it seemed, was a French national, working for the French resistance. James had met her during his intelligence work, their paths crossing in the shadowy world of espionage and counter-espionage. They had become lovers, partners in a dangerous game, their lives intertwined in a web of secrets and shared risks. The letters spoke of clandestine meetings, coded messages, narrow escapes. They spoke of a love that defied borders, a love that blossomed in the midst of chaos and destruction. They spoke of a commitment, a loyalty, that went beyond the conventional bonds of marriage. Margaret felt a mixture of emotions as she read the letters, anger, betrayal, jealousy, but also a grudging respect. She could see, through James's words, the depth of his feelings for Isabel, the intensity of their connection. She could understand, In a way, why he had been drawn to her, why he had chosen this dangerous, secret life. But there were also hints of something else in the letters, something darker, more troubling. There were veiled references to a mission, a project that was of vital importance. There were warnings about betrayal, about enemies within their own ranks. There were expressions of fear, of a growing sense of unease. The final letter, written just days before James's supposed death, was particularly chilling. "My dearest Isabel," it read, "I fear that our time is running out. The serpent has coiled itself around us, and I fear its venomous strike. I have made arrangements, a contingency plan, in case the worst should happen. I have entrusted everything to a friend, a man I trust implicitly. He will know what to do. If you receive this letter, it means I am gone. But know this, my love, I will never truly leave you. My heart will always be yours, forever entwined with yours, beneath the cherry blossoms." Margaret's heart ached as she read the words. The cherry blossoms. Alistair's words echoed in her mind. He was supposed to meet her there, you know. Today. The serpent. Who was the serpent? Who had betrayed James? And who had killed him, not once, but twice? She closed the box, her mind racing. The friend James had mentioned, the one he had entrusted with everything, could it be Alistair? He had known about Project Nightingale. He had the package. He had been James's commanding officer, his friend. But Alistair had also been the one to deliver the news of James's death, the one who had told her there were no survivors. Could he have been lying? Could he have been involved in James's disappearance, in his subsequent murder? The thought was unsettling, a betrayal of the trust she had placed in him. But she couldn't dismiss it. She had to consider all possibilities, no matter how painful. She picked up the small leather journal she had noticed when Silas opened the box. She opened the cover and flipped through the entries and realized, with growing horror, what it contained. Names.
Dates.
Places. It was a ledger. Of payments.
Of bribes.
And as she neared the last entry, a name, scrawled in hasty ink, caught her eye. A. Davies. And beside it, a sum of money. A very large sum of money. A price, perhaps, for silence. Chapter 9. Scars of the Past. The journal slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. The name A. Davies, the sum of money, the damning evidence. It was a punch to the gut, a betrayal that cut deeper than any she had ever imagined. Alistair. The man she had trusted, the man who had comforted her, the man who had promised to help her find the truth. He was involved. Her mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the image of the kind, compassionate Alistair with the cold, calculating figure implicated in James's journal. Could it be a mistake? A different A. Davies? But the context, the other entries in the journal, the nature of Project Nightingale, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. She picked up the journal again, her hands shaking. She flipped back through the pages, examining the entries more closely. The names were mostly unfamiliar, code names perhaps, or aliases. But there were a few she recognized, names of prominent figures in Washington society, government officials, military officers. People in positions of power, people with secrets to protect. The journal was a record of illicit transactions, of bribes and payoffs, of a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. James, it seemed, had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that had cost him his life. And Alistair, his trusted friend, had been a part of it. Margaret felt a wave of nausea, a bitter taste in her mouth. She had been so naive, so trusting. She had believed in the inherent goodness of people, in the ideals of justice and honor. But the war and its aftermath had shown her a different reality, a world of shadows and deceit, where loyalty was a commodity and truth was a dangerous weapon. She closed the journal, her mind racing. What should she do? Go to the police? But who could she trust? Alistair had contacts everywhere, influence that reached into every corner of the city's power structure. He could silence her, discredit her, make her disappear, just like he had done with James. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would withstand scrutiny, evidence that would expose Alistair and his network of corruption. The journal was a start, But it wasn't enough. She needed something more, something that would tie Alistair directly to James's murder. She thought of the photograph, the one of James and Isabel in front of the European building. It was a clue, a piece of the puzzle that might lead her to the truth. She needed to identify the building, to find out where the photograph had been taken and why. She remembered Alistair mentioning a former colleague, a woman named Evelyn Reed, who worked at the Library of Congress. Evelyn was a researcher, a specialist in European history and architecture. She might be able to help. Margaret hesitated. Could she trust Evelyn? She was Alistair's friend, after all. But she had no other choice. She had to take the risk. She found Evelyn's number in the city directory and dialed, her hand trembling. Evelyn answered on the third ring, her voice warm and welcoming. "Margaret? It's so good to hear from you. Alistair told me about James."
"I'm so sorry."
Margaret took a deep breath. "Evelyn, I need your help. It's about something I found. A photograph. I need to identify the building in it." There was a pause, a moment of hesitation. A photograph? What kind of building? Margaret described the building as best she could, the ornate columns, the sweeping staircase, the distinctive architectural details. Evelyn listened patiently, her questions precise and insightful. It sounds like it might be the Palais Justice in Brussels," Evelyn said finally. "But I'd need to see the photograph to be sure." Brussels.
Belgium.
James had been stationed in France, but he had mentioned in his letters to Isabel that he had traveled to Brussels on several occasions. "Can I bring it to you?" Margaret asked. "Tomorrow morning?" "Of course," Evelyn said. "Come to the library. I'll be in the main reading room." Margaret hung up the phone, her heart pounding. She had a lead, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But she also knew that she was walking a tightrope, balancing between the need for answers and the ever-present danger that surrounded her. She spent the rest of the night going through James's belongings, searching for any other clues, any other hints of his secret life. She found nothing, only the remnants of the man she thought she knew, the man who had been a stranger to her all along. As dawn approached, casting a pale light through the window, Margaret felt a sense of exhaustion, but also a renewed determination. She would not give up. She would not let James's death be in vain. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She would expose the serpent and all its coils. The scars of the past, both hers and James's, would not be ignored. Chapter 10. A Dance with Shadows. The Library of Congress, with its grand architecture and imposing presence, felt both intimidating and comforting. The hushed atmosphere, the scent of old books, the rows of silent readers, it was a world away from the chaos and violence that had engulfed Margaret's life. She found Evelyn in the main reading room, surrounded by stacks of books and documents. Evelyn was a striking woman, tall and elegant, with a sharp intelligence that shone in her eyes. She greeted Margaret with a warm smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a reflection of the tragedy that had brought them together. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," Evelyn said, her voice soft. "Alistair told me everything. It's unbelievable." Margaret nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She handed Evelyn the photograph, her hand trembling slightly. "I need to know where this was taken."
"And why?"
Evelyn took the photograph, her gaze fixed on the image. She examined it carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's the Palais Justice in Brussels," she confirmed, her voice low. "Just as I suspected. It's a significant building. The seat of the Belgian Supreme Court." "But why would James be there?" Margaret asked. "He was stationed in France, not Belgium." Evelyn hesitated. Brussels was a hub of activity during the war, a center for espionage, counterintelligence. A lot of clandestine operations took place there. She paused, her gaze meeting Margaret's. The Palais Justice, it was more than just a courthouse. It was also used for other purposes. Secret meetings, interrogations, even executions. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The photograph, the building, James's presence there, it all pointed to something dark and dangerous, something that had cost him his life. "There's something else," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "The woman in the photograph, I recognize her." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. You do? Who is she? Evelyn's face was pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Her name is Isabelle Dubois. She was a known collaborator. She worked with the Germans. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Isabelle. James's lover. A collaborator. A traitor. The room seemed to spin around her, the hushed atmosphere replaced by a roaring in her ears. She felt a wave of nausea, a bitter taste in her mouth. No, she whispered. It can't be. James, he wouldn't. Evelyn shook her head.
I'm sorry, Margaret.
But it's true. Isabelle Dubois was notorious. She betrayed her own people. She handed over countless resistance fighters to the Germans. She was responsible for so much death and suffering. Margaret felt a sense of betrayal, so profound, so devastating, that it threatened to consume her. James, her beloved James, had been involved with a traitor, a woman who had collaborated with the enemy. But something didn't fit. The letters, the love, the devotion, the shared risks, it didn't make sense. James, despite his secrets, had been a patriot, a man of honor. He wouldn't have knowingly associated with a collaborator, let alone fallen in love with one. There has to be more to it, Margaret said, her voice shaking. There has to be an explanation. Evelyn looked at her, her gaze filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked like fear. Margaret, she said softly, you need to be careful. This is a dangerous path you're on. There are people who would want this information to remain buried. People who would go to great lengths to protect their secrets. She paused, her gaze flickering towards the entrance of the reading room. I shouldn't be telling you this. Alistair, he wouldn't approve. Margaret felt a surge of anger, of defiance. Alistair. The man who had betrayed James, the man who is now trying to control the narrative, to keep her from the truth. I don't care what Alistair approves of, she said, her voice firm. I need to know the truth. About James, about Isabelle, about everything. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze searching Margaret's face. There's one more thing. Something I overheard. A conversation between Alistair and another man. They were talking about Project Nightingale. They were talking about a double agent. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. A double agent. Could it be? Could Isabelle have been working for both sides? Who? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who was the double agent? Evelyn shook her head. I don't know. They didn't mention a name. But they said that the double agent had been exposed. That they had taken care of it. Taken care of it. The words echoed in Margaret's mind, chilling and ominous. They had killed James, thinking he was the double agent. Or had they killed Isabelle and framed James? She stood and thanked Evelyn, who looked at her with fear shining in her eyes. Be careful, Margaret, she whispered again. Please. Margaret nodded. She had to know what Alistair knew. She had to find a way to find the last piece of the puzzle that had, twice, ended James' life. And the dance with shadows would take her straight to the serpent's lair. Chapter 11. The Unveiling. Margaret knew she couldn't confront Alistair directly. He was too powerful, too connected. He would deny everything, and she had no concrete proof, only suspicions and circumstantial evidence. She needed to find a way to get him to reveal himself, to expose his involvement in James's death without putting herself in immediate danger. She decided to use the one weapon she had. Information. She would let Alistair know that she was getting closer to the truth, that she was uncovering his secrets. She would use his own paranoia against him. She returned to her apartment and crafted a careful, cryptic note. She didn't mention Alistair by name, but she alluded to the journal, to the photograph, to Isabelle Dubois. She hinted at a conspiracy, a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. She ended the note with a single, chilling sentence. The serpent is about to be unmasked. She addressed the note to Alistair, using his office address at the Bureau of Investigation. She considered sending it anonymously, but then decided against it. She wanted him to know that it was her, that she was the one who was pursuing him. It was a risk, but it was a calculated one. She mailed the note, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she was playing a dangerous game, a game of cat and mouse with a man who had already proven himself to be ruthless and deadly. But she had no other choice. She had to fight back for James, for herself, for the truth. She spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every sound, every shadow. She avoided going out, staying holed up in her apartment, poring over James's letters, the journal, the photograph, searching for any other clues, any other pieces of the puzzle. She focused on Isabelle Dubois. She researched her background, her connections, her activities during the war. She discovered that Isabelle had been a prominent figure in Parisian society, a socialite known for her beauty, her charm, and her ambiguous political affiliations. She had been linked to several high-ranking German officers, but she had also been rumored to be involved with the French resistance. She had walked a tightrope, balancing between both sides, using her connections to gather information, to protect herself, to survive. Margaret began to see Isabelle in a different light. Not as a simple traitor, but as a complex, enigmatic figure, a woman who had played a dangerous game, a woman who had perhaps been more sinned against than sinning. She wondered if James had known the truth about Isabelle. Had he been aware of her double life? Or had he been blinded by love, by his own idealistic vision of her? The answer, she suspected, lay in the final, unread letters. The letters that James had written to Isabelle in the days leading up to his supposed death. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the box. She had avoided reading those letters, fearing the pain, the betrayal that they might contain. But now, she knew that she had to face them. She had to know the truth, whatever it might be. She opened the box and took out the remaining letters. She arranged them in chronological order, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and began to read. The first few letters were similar to the ones she had read before, filled with expressions of love, of longing, of shared secrets. But as she progressed through the letters, she noticed a change in tone. James's words became more guarded, more cautious. He expressed his growing concerns about the mission, about the dangers that surrounded them. He mentioned a mole, a traitor within their ranks, someone who was leaking information to the enemy. He didn't name names, but he hinted at his suspicions, his growing unease. And then, in the final letter, the one written just days before his official death, he revealed the truth. "My dearest Isabelle," it read, "I have discovered the identity of the serpent. It is not who we thought. It is someone I trusted implicitly. Someone close to me. I fear that I have been betrayed, my love. That I have been played for a fool. I have made arrangements, a contingency plan, in case the worst should happen. But I fear it is too late. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. But know this, my love. I did not betray you. I did not betray our cause. I was a victim of my own naivete, my own misplaced trust. The truth lies with the nightingale. Find the nightingale, my love, and expose the serpent. For me. For us. For the future." Margaret's heart ached as she read the words. James had not betrayed Isabelle. He had been the victim, not the perpetrator. He had been murdered, not by the enemy, but by someone he had considered a friend. By Alistair. The nightingale. What was the nightingale? Another code name? Another piece of the puzzle? She reread the letter, searching for any other clues, any other hints. And then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible mark on the back of the envelope. A tiny, stylized drawing of a nightingale. She turned the envelope over, examining the drawing closely. It was intricate, detailed, almost like a signature. She had seen that mark before. She rushed to her desk, pulling open drawers, rummaging through papers. She found it. The small, velvet-lined box that had contained the ring. The ring that James had given her. The ring she had thrown into the river. On the inside of the box, hidden beneath the velvet lining, was the same mark. The nightingale. Margaret stared at the mark, and the pieces of the puzzle, so scattered, were starting to come together. The truth, and a trap, was finally unveiled. Chapter 12. Echoes of Gunfire. The nightingale mark on the ring box was the key, The final piece of the puzzle that unlocked the truth about James's secret life and his tragic death, both of them. The ring, the symbol of his love for Margaret, had also been a symbol of his connection to Isabel, to Project Nightingale, to a world of espionage and betrayal. Margaret realized that the jeweler, the one who had disappeared after the war, must have been the Nightingale. He had been the one who had crafted the ring, the one who had known about James's secret mission, the one who had perhaps been a part of the network of spies and double agents. And Alistair had known all along. He had known about the ring, about the Nightingale, about James's involvement with Isabel. He had used that knowledge to manipulate her, to control her, to keep her from the truth. He had been playing a double game, pretending to be her friend and confidant, while secretly working to protect his own interests, to cover up his own crimes. Margaret felt a surge of anger, of outrage, but also a sense of relief. The truth, though painful, was finally out in the open. She knew who her enemy was, and she knew what she had to do. She couldn't go to the police. Alistair had too much influence, too many connections. He would find a way to silence her, to discredit her. She needed to find another way to expose him, to bring him to justice. She decided to confront him. Not directly, not yet. But she would let him know that she knew the truth, that she was no longer under his control. She would use his own arrogance, his own overconfidence, against him. She arranged a meeting with Alistair, choosing a public place, a busy cafe near the tidal basin. She wanted witnesses, people who could see them together, people who could corroborate her story if something happened to her. She arrived early, choosing a table near the window, where she could see anyone approaching. She ordered a coffee, her hands trembling slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a mixture of fear and determination. Alistair arrived a few minutes later, his face a mask of concern. He greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes searching hers. "Margaret, you look pale," he said, his voice filled with a feigned solicitude. "Are you all right? You shouldn't be pushing yourself so hard. This investigation, it's taking its toll on you." Margaret met his gaze, her eyes cold and unwavering. "I know, Alistair," she said, her voice steady. "I know everything." Alistair's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise, of unease, crossing his face. "Know what, Margaret? What are you talking about?" She reached into her bag and pulled out the journal, the photograph, the letters. She placed them on the table, in front of him. "I know about Project Nightingale," she said. "I know about Isabel Dubois. I know about the bribes, the payoffs, the network of corruption. And I know about your involvement." Alistair's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. He glanced around the cafe, his gaze lingering on the other patrons. He leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "Margaret, you don't know what you're talking about. You're imagining things. You're letting your grief cloud your judgment." She shook her head.
"No, Alistair.
"I'm not imagining things. I have proof. The journal, the letters, the photograph, and the ring." She pulled the ring from her pocket, the diamond flashing in the sunlight. "The Nightingale, Alistair. The jeweler who made this ring, he disappeared, didn't he? Just like James disappeared. Twice." Alistair stared at the ring, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like regret. "You set him up," Margaret said, her voice trembling with anger. "You betrayed him. You used him, and then you killed him. You killed him because he knew too much, because he was about to expose you." Alistair didn't deny it. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the ring, his silence a confession. Margaret felt a wave of satisfaction, of triumph. She had broken through his facade. She had exposed his lies. But she also knew that she was still in danger. Alistair was a desperate man, a man with nothing to lose. "I'm going to the authorities, Alistair," she said, her voice firm. "I'm going to expose you, and everyone else involved. You won't get away with this." Alistair finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a coldness in his gaze, a ruthlessness that sent a shiver down her spine. "You think you can win, Margaret?" he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "You think you can take me down? You're just one woman alone against a network of power and influence. You have no idea what you're up against. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a barely audible murmur. You should have stayed out of it, Margaret. You should have let the past bury itself. Now you've made yourself a target. Suddenly, the sounds of the cafe faded. A sharp ringing in her ears, a crack, like thunder, and a spray of red across Alistair's shirt. He slumped back in his chair, his eyes wide, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. Gunfire. From somewhere outside. Margaret screamed, dropping to the floor, the sound of chaos erupting around her. The serpent had struck again. But this time, the coils had tightened around the wrong victim. Or had they? Chapter 13. The Weight of Loyalty. Chaos reigned in the cafe. Screams, shouts, the shattering of glass, the clatter of overturned tables. It was a scene of pandemonium. Margaret, crouched on the floor, her ears ringing, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Alistair.
Shot.
Just like James. People were running, scrambling for cover, their faces a mixture of terror and confusion. Margaret crawled towards Alistair, her body trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. He was slumped in his chair, his eyes still open, but unseeing. The crimson stain on his shirt had spread, soaking the fabric, a stark testament to the violence that had erupted. She reached out, her hand hovering over his body, afraid to touch him, afraid to confirm the reality of what she was seeing. He was dead. Alistair, the man who had betrayed James, the man who had threatened her, was dead. The police arrived, their sirens wailing, their presence bringing a semblance of order to the chaos. They questioned witnesses, secured the area, their movements efficient and detached. Margaret watched them, numb, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. She was taken to the police station, questioned for hours, her story recounted again and again. She told them everything about the ring, the note, the letters, the journal, the photograph, her suspicions about Alistair, their meeting at the cafe, his threats, the shooting. The police listened patiently, their questions precise and insightful. They seemed skeptical, hesitant to believe her story, a story that implicated a high-ranking official of the Bureau of Investigation in a conspiracy that reached back to the war. But she had the evidence. The journal, the letters, the photograph, they were tangible proof of Alistair's involvement, of James's secret life, of the network of corruption that had cost him his life. The police took the evidence, promising to investigate, to follow up on her leads. But Margaret knew that it wouldn't be easy. Alistair had friends in high places, people who would want to protect him, to cover up his crimes. She was released, exhausted and emotionally drained, her future uncertain. She returned to her apartment, the silence deafening after the chaos of the day's events. She felt a mixture of grief, relief, and a lingering sense of unease. Alistair was dead, but the serpent was still out there. The network of corruption, the people who had been involved in James's death, they were still free. And they would be looking for her, wanting to silence her, to prevent her from exposing the truth. She thought of Evelyn, Alistair's friend at the Library of Congress. Evelyn had warned her, had told her to be careful. Evelyn had known about Project Nightingale, about the double agent, about Alistair's involvement. Could Evelyn be trusted? Or was she a part of the conspiracy, a pawn in Alistair's game? Margaret didn't know. She couldn't trust anyone. She was alone, isolated, a target in a dangerous game. She spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert, jumping at every sound, every shadow. She avoided going out, staying holed up in her apartment, her only contact with the outside world the occasional phone call from the police, updating her on the progress of their investigation. The investigation, it seemed, was moving slowly. There were obstacles, roadblocks, bureaucratic delays. Margaret sensed a reluctance, a hesitation, to pursue the case aggressively, to uncover the truth that might implicate powerful figures in Washington society. She grew increasingly frustrated, impatient. She knew that time was running out, that the killers were still out there, that they might be planning their next move. She was alone in her endeavor. She had pushed everyone away. For their safety, she had told herself. One evening, as she sat by the window, staring out at the night sky, she heard a knock on her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Who could it be? The police? The killers? She peered through the peephole. It was a woman she didn't recognize. Tall, elegant, with dark hair and striking features. She held herself with a poise and confidence. Margaret hesitated. She didn't know this woman, but there was something familiar about her, something that tugged at her memory. And then she remembered the picture. James. Brussels. And the woman in the shadows. She opened the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Margaret Calloway?" she asked. "My name is Isabelle Dubois," she said. Her voice was soft and accented and broke Margaret's heart anew. Chapter 14. A Shattered Mirror. Isabelle. The name echoed in Margaret's mind, a ghost from the past, a figure from James's secret life, a woman who had been both his lover and, potentially, his betrayer. And now, she stood before her, on her doorstep, a tangible presence in a world that had become increasingly surreal. "Isabelle?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how?" Isabel's smile faded, replaced by a look of profound sadness. "I know this must be a shock, Margaret, but I needed to see you, to talk to you about James." Margaret hesitated, her mind reeling. Could she trust this woman? The woman who had shared James's life, his secrets, his love? The woman who had been accused of being a collaborator, a traitor? But there was something in Isabel's eyes, a sincerity, a vulnerability, that compelled Margaret to listen. She stepped aside, inviting Isabel into the apartment. The apartment felt small and cramped with Isabel's presence. She was taller than Margaret had imagined, her movements graceful and elegant, her clothes stylish and expensive, a stark contrast to Margaret's simple, practical attire. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Margaret studied Isabel's face, searching for clues, for answers, for any sign of deception. Isabel's eyes were dark and expressive, filled with a mixture of grief, regret, and something else. Something that looked like determination. "I know about you, Margaret," Isabel said softly, her voice tinged with a French accent. "James, he told me everything. He loved you very much." Margaret felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp reminder of the love she had shared with James, a love that had been overshadowed by his secret life, by his relationship with Isabel. "He loved you too, Isabel," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've read the letters." Isabel nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "The letters, they were our lifeline. Our way of staying connected, of sharing our fears, our hopes, our love." She looked up, her eyes meeting Margaret's. "I know what you must think of me, Margaret. A collaborator, a traitor. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing was simple during the war." She paused, her voice taking on a harder edge. "I was working for the resistance, Margaret. I was a double agent. I used my connections with the Germans to gather information, to help my people, to sabotage their efforts." Margaret listened, her mind struggling to reconcile the conflicting images of Isabel, the glamorous socialite, the accused collaborator, the grieving lover, the defiant resistance fighter. "James, he knew?" Margaret asked. Isabel nodded. "He knew. He was the one who recruited me. He was my handler, my contact, my partner." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "We fell in love, Margaret. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rational. But it happened. We were drawn to each other, two souls caught in a storm, clinging to each other for survival." Margaret felt a wave of empathy for Isabel, a recognition of the shared pain, the shared loss that bound them together. They had both loved James in different ways, and they had both been betrayed by him, by his secrets, by his death. "Alistair," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. He was involved, wasn't he? He betrayed James. Isabel's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. Alastair Davies, he was the serpent, Margaret. The mole who had been leaking information to the enemy. He was jealous of James, of his success, of his relationship with me. She paused, her voice filled with a bitter anger. He set James up. He framed him, made him look like the double agent. And then he killed him. He killed him to protect himself, to cover up his own crimes. Margaret felt a sense of vindication, of confirmation. Her suspicions about Alastair had been correct. He had been the enemy all along. But Alastair is dead, Margaret said. He was shot. Just like James. Isabel's expression changed, a flicker of surprise, of confusion, crossing her face. Dead? Alastair Davies is dead?
How?
Margaret recounted the events at the cafe, the shooting, the chaos, the police investigation. Isabel listened, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. Who would kill Alastair?
And why?
Margaret shook her head. I don't know. But I think it's connected to Project Nightingale. To the network of corruption that James uncovered. She paused, her gaze meeting Isabel's. There are others involved, Isabel. Powerful people, people who would want to silence us, to prevent us from exposing the truth. Isabel nodded, her face grim. We have to be careful, Margaret. We're in danger. But we can't give up. We have to find out who killed James, who killed Alastair, and why. We have to expose them, bring them to justice. Margaret felt a renewed sense of determination, a surge of strength that came from sharing her burden, from finding an ally in the most unexpected of places. We'll do it together, Isabel, she said, her voice firm. For James. For us. For the truth. She looked at the Frenchwoman again, really looked at her, and felt a jolt. The hair, the eyes, the line of her jaw. She stood and took the photograph from the box, the one of James in Brussels, and handed it to Isabel. Isabel took it and paled. Her hands trembled as she pointed at the woman in the shadows, the one they had thought was her. That is not me, she whispered. That is my sister, Genevieve. And the shattered mirror of her understanding reflected not one betrayal, but a labyrinth of them. Chapter 15. Between Two Worlds. Genevieve. The name hung in the air, a new piece in the complex puzzle that was James's life and death. Isabel's sister. A woman who looked strikingly similar to Isabel, but who, apparently, had played a very different role in the war. Your sister? Margaret asked, her voice filled with disbelief. But why was she with James? In Brussels? Isabel's face was etched with pain, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and confusion. I don't know, Margaret. I haven't seen Genevieve since before the war. We were estranged. She disapproved of my choices, of my involvement with the resistance. She paused, her voice trembling slightly. Genevieve, she was always the proper one, the conventional one. She married a wealthy businessman, a man with connections. Connections to the Germans. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Genevieve, the collaborator. Not Isabel. But why had James been with her? Was he working with her? Had he been deceived by her, just as he had been deceived by Alastair? I don't understand, Margaret said, her voice shaking. If Genevieve was the collaborator, why was James with her? Why was he? Isabel shook her head. I don't know, Margaret. But I have a feeling, a terrible feeling that Genevieve was involved in James's death. That she betrayed him. She paused, her gaze meeting Margaret's. We need to find out the truth, Margaret. We need to find out what happened to James, what happened to Alastair, and what role Genevieve played in all of this. Margaret nodded, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still gaps, still unanswered questions. They decided to combine their knowledge, their resources, to investigate Genevieve, to uncover her connections, her activities during the war. They spent the next few days poring over documents, letters, photographs, searching for any clue, any hint of Genevieve's involvement in James's life, in his death. Isabel had brought with her a small suitcase, filled with her own belongings, her own mementos of James. Among them, she found a letter from James to Isabel, written just a few weeks before his official death. My dearest Isabel, it read. I have met your sister. She is not what I expected. She is playing a dangerous game, a game that could cost us everything. I fear that she is not to be trusted, my love. That she is using us, to further her own agenda. I have taken precautions, measures to protect myself, to protect you. But I fear that it may not be enough. If anything should happen to me, my love, know this. I love you. I have always loved you. And I will always be with you. In spirit, in memory, in the whispers of the wind. Margaret's heart ached as she read the words. James had suspected Genevieve, had feared her betrayal. But he had been unable to prevent it, unable to save himself. He knew, Margaret whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He knew that she was dangerous. Isabel nodded, her eyes filled with tears. He knew, but he underestimated her. He underestimated the lengths she would go to, the power she wielded. They continued their investigation, piecing together the fragments of information, following the trail of clues that led them deeper and deeper into the labyrinth of Genevieve's world. They discovered that Genevieve had been a prominent figure in the collaborationist circles of occupied Paris, a socialite who had used her beauty, her charm, and her husband's connections to cultivate relationships with high-ranking German officers. She had been a conduit of information, a spy who had betrayed her own people, who had handed over countless resistance fighters to the Gestapo. She had been responsible for so much death and suffering. But there was more. They also discovered that Genevieve had been involved in Project Nightingale, that she had been working with Alistair Davies, that she had been a part of the network of corruption that had cost James his life. She was the serpent, Margaret said, her voice filled with a bitter realization. Not Alistair. Genevieve. She was the one who had been pulling the strings, manipulating everyone, betraying everyone. Isabel nodded, her face grim. She was the one who killed James, Margaret. She was the one who ordered his death. And she was the one who killed Alistair, to silence him, to protect herself. Margaret felt a surge of anger, of outrage, but also a sense of closure. The truth, though painful, was finally out in the open. They knew who their enemy was, and they knew what they had to do. We have to stop her, Isabel, Margaret said, her voice firm. We have to expose her, bring her to justice. For James. For us. For all those who suffered because of her. But the question was, where was Genevieve? They were living between two worlds, it seemed. The world they had once known, before the ring, and the world of shadows and betrayals that it had unveiled. Chapter 16. The Cost of Freedom. Finding Genevieve proved to be more challenging than Margaret and Isabel had anticipated. She had vanished, disappeared without a trace after Alistair's death, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a legacy of betrayal. They searched for her in Washington, in Paris, in Brussels, following every lead, every rumor, every whisper of her whereabouts. They contacted former resistance fighters, intelligence agents, government officials, anyone who might have had information about Genevieve, about her activities during the war, about her connections to Project Nightingale. But Genevieve was like a ghost, a phantom who had slipped through their fingers, leaving behind only shadows and echoes. She had covered her tracks well, erasing any evidence of her existence, of her involvement in the conspiracy that had cost James his life. Margaret and Isabel grew increasingly frustrated, discouraged. They felt like they were chasing a shadow, a figment of their imagination. They began to doubt themselves, to question their assumptions, to wonder if they had been wrong about Genevieve all along. But they couldn't give up. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. They owed it to James, to themselves, to all those who had suffered because of Genevieve's actions, to continue their search, to uncover the truth, to bring her to justice. One evening, as they sat in Margaret's apartment, poring over documents, letters, photographs, searching for any clue, any hint of Genevieve's whereabouts, Isabel found something. It was a small, faded photograph, tucked away in a corner of James's journal. It was a picture of Genevieve, taken before the war, in a garden setting. She was standing next to a man Margaret didn't recognize. He was older than Genevieve, handsome, with a distinguished air and a cruel smile. "Who is this?" Margaret asked, her voice curious. Isabel studied the photograph, her brow furrowed in concentration.
"I don't know," she said.
"I don't recognize him. But there's something familiar about him. Something about his eyes." She paused, her gaze flickering towards the window, as if she were looking at something far away, something lost in the mists of time. I remember Genevieve mentioning him once," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She said, he was her protector, her benefactor, the man who had introduced her to the world of power, of influence. She looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with a sudden realization. I think this man might be the key, Margaret. The key to finding Genevieve, to uncovering the truth about Project Nightingale." They decided to focus their efforts on identifying the man in the photograph, on tracing his connections, his activities, his relationship with Genevieve. They contacted Evelyn Reed, Margaret's friend at the Library of Congress, and asked for her help. Evelyn, despite her initial reluctance, agreed to assist them, using her expertise in European history and genealogy to track down the man's identity. After several days of painstaking research, Evelyn finally found him. "His name is Baron Heinrich von Clausen," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He was a prominent figure in pre-war Germany, a wealthy industrialist, a close associate of the Nazi Party. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The Nazi Party. Genevieve had been involved with the Nazis, not just as a collaborator, but as a willing participant, a co-conspirator. Von Clausen, he was a dangerous man, Evelyn continued. He was involved in all sorts of illicit activities. Espionage, arms dealing, political intrigue. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer, who pulled the strings from behind the scenes. She paused, her gaze meeting Margaret's. "He disappeared after the war, Margaret. Vanished without a trace. Just like Genevieve." Margaret and Isabel exchanged a look. They had found their connection, their link to Genevieve.
Baron von Clausen.
The man in the photograph, the man who had been Genevieve's protector, her benefactor, her partner in crime. They knew that finding von Clausen would be difficult, dangerous. He was a powerful man, with connections to the darkest corners of the underworld. He would be protected, hidden, surrounded by people who would be willing to kill to keep his secret safe. But they had no other choice. They had to find him. They had to find Genevieve. They had to bring them to justice. The cost of freedom, they realized, was eternal vigilance. And they were ready to be vigilant. Isabel looked down at the photograph and closed her eyes. She spoke, so quiet Margaret could barely hear. "He had an estate. In Switzerland. I think I remember Genevieve mentioning it." And with a renewed fire, both of them looked at each other. It was time. Chapter 17. Whispers in the Dark. Switzerland. The land of neutrality, of snow-capped mountains and pristine lakes, of hidden bank accounts and secret deals. It was the perfect place for someone like Baron von Clausen and Genevieve to disappear, to hide from the world, to enjoy the spoils of their ill-gotten gains. Margaret and Isabel traveled to Switzerland, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They knew that they were entering a dangerous world, a world of shadows and whispers, where the truth was elusive and the stakes were high. They started their search in Zurich, the financial heart of Switzerland, where von Clausen had been known to have business dealings. They contacted bankers, lawyers, private investigators, anyone who might have had information about von Clausen, about his estate, about his current whereabouts. But they encountered a wall of silence, a conspiracy of secrecy that protected the wealthy and powerful. No one was willing to talk, to reveal any information that might compromise their clients, their interests, their own safety. Margaret and Isabel grew increasingly frustrated, discouraged. They felt like they were chasing ghosts, phantoms who had vanished into the thin mountain air. They decided to shift their focus to the Swiss countryside, to the remote villages and secluded estates where von Clausen might have chosen to hide. They traveled from town to town, asking questions, showing the photograph of von Clausen, searching for any clue, any hint of his presence. They encountered suspicion, hostility, a reluctance to cooperate with outsiders, with strangers who were asking too many questions. The Swiss, it seemed, valued their privacy, their neutrality, above all else. One evening, as they sat in a small, rustic inn in a remote mountain village, feeling defeated and exhausted, they overheard a conversation between two men at a nearby table. The men were speaking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible above the crackling of the fire in the hearth. But Margaret and Isabel, their senses heightened by weeks of searching, of living on the edge, caught snippets of their conversation. Von Clausen, one of the men, said. The estate visitors' secrecy. Margaret and Isabel exchanged a look. They had found a lead, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. They waited until the men had left the inn, and then approached the innkeeper, a gruff, elderly man with a weathered face and suspicious eyes. They showed him the photograph of von Clausen, asking if he recognized the man, if he knew anything about his estate. The innkeeper hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the door, as if he were afraid of being overheard. He studied the photograph, his brow furrowed in concentration. I may have seen him, he said finally, his voice low and hesitant. Years ago. He used to come to the village sometimes. To buy supplies.
He was a quiet man.
Kept to himself. He paused, his gaze meeting Margaret's. There is an estate. High up in the mountains. It's isolated. Secluded. No one goes there. It's said to be haunted. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Haunted. The word sent a shiver down her spine. But it also gave her a sense of hope, a feeling that they were getting closer to their quarry. Can you tell us how to get there? Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. The innkeeper hesitated again. It's dangerous. The road is treacherous. And the people who live there, they don't like visitors. They're protective of their privacy. He paused, his gaze searching Margaret's face. Why are you looking for him? What do you want with von Clausen? Margaret met his gaze, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. We're looking for justice, she said. For someone he wronged. Someone he killed. The innkeeper studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. I'll tell you how to get there, he said. But be warned. You're entering a world where the past is never truly buried. Where the whispers in the dark can kill. He drew a rough map on a napkin, showing the location of the estate, the winding road that led up into the mountains, the treacherous curves and steep cliffs. Margaret and Isabel thanked him, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had a destination, a target, a place where they might finally find Genevieve, where they might finally uncover the truth about James's death. As they left the inn, stepping out into the cold night air, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the echoes of gunfire, the chilling presence of the serpent. They knew that their journey, their quest was coming to a head. Chapter 18. A Glimmer of Hope. The road to von Clausen's estate was as treacherous as the innkeeper had warned. It wound its way up into the mountains, a narrow, twisting path carved into the sheer rock face, with steep drops and blind curves that tested their nerves and their driving skills. The scenery was breathtaking, with snow-capped peaks towering above them and deep valleys stretching out below. But Margaret and Isabel had little time to appreciate the beauty of the landscape. They were focused on their destination, on the estate that lay hidden somewhere ahead, on the confrontation that awaited them. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, the wind sharper, the sense of isolation more profound. They felt like they were entering another world, a world removed from the ordinary rules and conventions of society, a world where anything was possible. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they saw it. The estate. It was perched on a high plateau, overlooking a vast expanse of mountains and valleys. It was a large, imposing structure, built of gray stone, with turrets and towers, and a forbidding air that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. It looked less like a home, and more like a fortress, a place designed to keep people out, to protect its secrets from prying eyes. They parked the car some distance from the estate, hidden among the trees, and approached on foot, their movements cautious and deliberate. They didn't know what to expect, who they might encounter, what dangers lay ahead. They circled the estate, observing the layout, the security measures, the potential points of entry. There were guards, armed men patrolling the perimeter, their faces grim and watchful. There were dogs, large and menacing, their barks echoing through the stillness of the mountains. It was clear that von Clausen and Genevieve were taking no chances. They were prepared for visitors, for intruders, for anyone who might threaten their secluded existence. Margaret and Isabel knew that they couldn't simply walk up to the front door and demand to see Genevieve. They needed a plan, a strategy, a way to infiltrate the estate without being detected. They decided to wait until nightfall, to use the cover of darkness to their advantage. They found a sheltered spot among the trees, where they could observe the estate without being seen, and settled down to wait. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the mountains, the estate took on an even more ominous appearance. The windows were dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of torches that illuminated the perimeter. The guards continued their patrols, their movements regular and predictable. The dogs barked occasionally, their howls echoing through the night. Margaret and Isabel waited, their nerves stretched taut, their senses heightened. They knew that this was their chance, their opportunity to confront Genevieve, to uncover the truth about James's death. As the hours passed, the moon rose high in the sky, casting a pale, ethereal light across the landscape. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the sense of pine and snow and the faint, distant sound of music. Margaret and Isabel exchanged a look. Music? Where was it coming from? They listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was definitely there. A melody, haunting and melancholic, played on a piano. They realized that the music was coming from the estate, from one of the windows on the upper floor. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign of life, a potential weakness in the fortress's defenses. They decided to use the music as their cover, their distraction. They would approach the estate under the cloak of darkness, using the sound of the piano to mask their movements, to draw the guards' attention away from their approach. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. But they had no other choice. They had to get inside the estate. They had to find Genevieve. As the moon reached its zenith, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, Margaret and Isabel began their approach. They moved slowly, silently, like shadows themselves, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breath catching in their throats. The music continued, a haunting melody that seemed to beckon them forward, to draw them into the heart of the serpent's lair. The serpent, however, was not expecting company. And she certainly was not expecting them. The piano continued, and Genevieve, lost in the music, never heard them enter. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. The interior of the estate was as opulent and forbidding as its exterior. The rooms were vast and high-ceilinged, decorated with antique furniture, priceless paintings, and elaborate tapestries. The air was heavy with the scent of old money, of secrets and lies, of a world far removed from Margaret's simple, ordinary life. They followed the sound of the piano, moving through the darkened hallways, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets, their senses on high alert. They passed closed doors, behind which they imagined untold secrets, hidden dangers, the remnants of a life built on betrayal and deceit. Finally, they reached the source of the music. A large, ornate door, slightly ajar, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. The piano music was louder now, clearer, a melancholic melody that seemed to express both beauty and sorrow, hope and despair. Margaret and Isabel exchanged a look. This was it. The moment of truth. The confrontation they had been preparing for, the reckoning that had been years in the making. They took a deep breath and pushed open the door, stepping into the room. The room was a music room, dominated by a grand piano that stood in the center, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Seated at the piano, her back to the door, was Genevieve. She was older than Margaret had imagined, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with age and experience. But she still possessed a striking beauty, a regal bearing, a sense of power and control that radiated from her presence. She was playing a Chopin nocturne, her fingers moving across the keys with a practiced grace, her body swaying slightly to the rhythm of the music. She seemed lost in the melody, unaware of their presence, oblivious to the danger that had entered her sanctuary. Margaret and Isabel stood in silence for a moment, watching her, listening to the music, their hearts pounding in their chests. The moment stretched out, filled with tension, with anticipation, with the weight of all that had come before. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the music like a knife.
"Genevieve," she said.
Genevieve stopped playing, her body stiffening, her hands frozen above the keys. She slowly turned, her head rising, her eyes meeting Margaret's. Her expression was one of surprise, of confusion, quickly replaced by a mask of cold indifference. She recognized Margaret, recognized the woman who had come to challenge her, to expose her, to bring her to justice. "Margaret Calloway," she said, her voice smooth and controlled, betraying no emotion. "What a surprise. What brings you to my home?" Margaret stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "We know, Genevieve," she said. "We know everything. About James, about Project Nightingale, about your involvement with the Nazis, about your betrayal." Genevieve's expression didn't change. She remained calm, composed, her eyes fixed on Margaret's.
"I don't know what you're talking about," she said.
"You're mistaken. You're letting your grief cloud your judgment." Isabel stepped forward, her voice filled with anger, with a bitter sense of betrayal. "Don't lie, Genevieve," she said. "We know the truth. We know that you killed James, that you ordered his death, that you framed him, made him look like the traitor, when it was you all along." Genevieve's composure finally cracked, a flicker of anger, of fear, crossing her face. She stood up from the piano, her body tense, her hands clenched into fists. "You have no proof," she said, her voice rising. "You have nothing. Just accusations, rumors, the ravings of a jealous woman." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out the journal, the letters, the photograph. She threw them on the piano, the papers scattering across the polished wood. "This is our proof, Genevieve," she said. "James's journal, his letters to Isabel, the photograph of you with Baron von Clausen. It's all here. The evidence of your crimes, of your betrayal, of your guilt." Genevieve stared at the documents, her face paling, her eyes widening with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She recognized the journal, the letters, the photograph. She knew that she had been exposed, that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. She lunged for a small pistol she had hidden inside the piano bench, but Isabel was quicker. A swift kick, and it clattered across the room. "It's over, Genevieve," Isabel said, her voice filled with a sad, weary resignation. "It's time to face the consequences of your actions." Genevieve looked from Isabel to Margaret, her eyes filled with a desperate, cornered animal fear. She knew that she had lost, that her reign of terror, of deceit, had come to an end. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to plead, to bargain. But before she could utter a word, a shot rang out, echoing through the room, through the estate, through the mountains. Genevieve staggered backward, her hand clutching her chest, a crimson stain spreading across her elegant dress. She looked at Margaret, at Isabel, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise, of pain, of regret. She collapsed to the floor, her body still, her life extinguished. The serpent was dead, but the shot had not come from them. It had come from the doorway. Standing there, a smoking gun in his hand, was Baron von Clausen. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "But it seems my associate had outlived her usefulness." He smiled, and the smile sent chills through them both. Chapter 20. Beyond the Horizon. Von Clausen's words hung in the air, a chilling testament to his ruthlessness, his complete disregard for human life. He had killed Genevieve without a flicker of remorse, as easily as one might swat a fly. He was the true serpent, the mastermind behind the conspiracy that had cost James's life, that had brought so much pain and suffering to so many. Margaret and Isabel stared at him, their bodies frozen in shock, their minds struggling to comprehend the sudden turn of events. They had come here to confront Genevieve, to bring her to justice, but they had stumbled into something far more dangerous, far more sinister. Von Clausen stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing them, calculating his next move. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his face etched with age and experience, his eyes cold and calculating. "You too have been persistent," he said, his voice a low purr. "Following the trail of breadcrumbs, uncovering secrets that were meant to remain buried. Very impressive." He paused, his gaze lingering on Margaret.
"You remind me of him, you know."
Of James. The same tenacity, the same foolish idealism. Margaret met his gaze, her fear battling with a surge of anger, of defiance. "We know who you are, von Clausen," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We know what you did. You killed James. You killed Genevieve. You're responsible for so much death and destruction." Von Clausen smiled, a cruel, mocking smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Death and destruction, they are merely tools, my dear. Means to an end. The pursuit of power, of control, of a new world order." He paused, his gaze shifting to Isabel. "And you, my dear Isabel, you were a disappointment. A pawn who dared to think for herself, to betray her benefactor." Isabel stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I was never your pawn, von Clausen," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I was James's partner, his lover. And I will see you brought to justice for what you did to him, for what you did to all of us." Von Clausen chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed through the room. "Justice? My dear Isabel, there is no justice in this world. Only power. And I have the power. You are merely inconveniences. Obstacles to be removed." He raised the gun, aiming it at Margaret, his finger tightening on the trigger. Margaret closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, for the final, fatal blow. But the shot never came. Instead, there was a shout, a scuffle, the sound of bodies struggling, of grunts and groans. Margaret opened her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Isabel had lunged at von Clausen, tackling him, knocking the gun from his hand. They were wrestling on the floor, a tangle of limbs, their faces contorted with effort, with desperation. Margaret saw her chance. She ran towards the gun, which had skidded across the floor, landing near the piano. She picked it up, her hands trembling, her mind racing. She had never fired a gun before, never even held one. But she knew that she had to do something to help Isabel, to stop von Clausen. She aimed the gun at von Clausen, her finger on the trigger, her body shaking with fear and adrenaline. But she hesitated. Could she do it? Could she take a life, even the life of a monster like von Clausen? She looked at Isabel, who was struggling to hold von Clausen down, her face bruised and bloodied, her strength waning. She knew that she had no choice. She had to act, quickly, decisively. She took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and fired. The shot echoed through the room, deafening, shattering the silence. Von Clausen jerked, his body convulsing, his eyes widening in surprise, in pain. He released Isabel, his grip loosening, his body slumping to the floor. Margaret lowered the gun, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her body trembling with shock and relief. She had done it. She had killed von Clausen. She had avenged James. She had stopped the serpent. Isabel slowly got to her feet, her body bruised and aching, her face streaked with blood and tears. She looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, of admiration, of a profound sadness. "It's over, Margaret," she said, her voice hoarse. "It's finally over." They stood there, in the silence of the music room, surrounded by the remnants of a shattered life, by the bodies of the two people who had caused them so much pain, so much suffering. The police arrived, alerted by the gunshots, by the commotion. They took Margaret and Isabel into custody, questioning them for hours, piecing together the events that had led to this final, violent confrontation. Margaret and Isabel told them everything, recounting the story of James, of Project Nightingale, of Genevieve, of von Clausen, of the network of corruption and betrayal that had spanned continents, that had reached the highest levels of power. The police listened, their faces grim, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and horror. They had uncovered a conspiracy of epic proportions, a web of deceit and violence that had remained hidden for years. Margaret and Isabel were eventually released, cleared of any wrongdoing, their actions deemed to be self-defense, a justifiable response to the threat posed by von Clausen. They had survived. They had brought the serpent to justice. They had avenged James. But the cost had been high, the scars deep, the memories haunting. As they left the police station, stepping out into the bright sunlight, the world seemed different, changed. They had been through a crucible, a trial by fire, that had transformed them, that had forged a bond between them, a bond of shared grief, of shared courage, of shared triumph. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. They had a long road ahead of them, a journey of healing, of recovery, of rebuilding their lives. But they would face it together. Two women, from different worlds, brought together by tragedy, by love, by a shared quest for justice. They had found each other, in the midst of the darkness, and they would walk together, towards the horizon, towards a future that was uncertain, but filled with the glimmer of a new dawn. The reckoning was over. But the healing was just beginning. Epilogue. The years that followed were a tapestry woven with threads of healing, remembrance, and a quiet, enduring peace. Margaret returned to Washington, D.C., but the city held too many ghosts, too many echoes of the past. She eventually moved to a small town in Virginia, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, far from the corridors of power and the shadows of intrigue. She never married. Mr. Henderson, the kind, dull accountant, had long since faded from her memory. The love she had shared with James, though brief and ultimately tragic, had left an indelible mark on her heart, a standard against which all other relationships paled in comparison. Isabel remained in Europe, rebuilding her life, working to heal the wounds of war and betrayal. She and Margaret corresponded regularly, their letters a lifeline, a connection to the shared experience that had bound them together. They visited each other occasionally, their friendship a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of forgiveness and understanding. The story of Project Nightingale, of Genevieve and von Clausen, of James's secret life and tragic death, eventually faded from public memory, relegated to the dusty archives of history. But for Margaret and Isabel, it remained a vivid, ever-present reality, a reminder of the cost of freedom, of the fragility of trust, of the enduring power of love. Margaret found solace in nature, in the quiet beauty of the mountains, in the changing seasons, in the simple rhythms of rural life. She took up gardening, cultivating a small patch of land behind her cottage, nurturing flowers and vegetables, finding a sense of peace and purpose in the act of creation. She often thought of James, of the life they might have had, of the future that had been stolen from them. But the pain had lessened, the sharp edges of grief softened by time and distance. She remembered him with a mixture of sadness and gratitude, cherishing the memories of their brief, intense love, a love that had defied borders, that had blossomed in the midst of chaos and destruction. One spring day, many years after the events in Switzerland, Margaret received a package from Isabel. It was a small, wooden box, intricately carved with a design of cherry blossoms. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, dried cherry blossom, preserved and fragile, a memento of a shared past, of a love that had transcended time and distance. Margaret held the blossom in her hand, her fingers tracing its delicate petals, her heart filled with a mixture of emotions, sadness, nostalgia, gratitude, and a quiet, enduring sense of peace. She walked out into her garden, the spring air filled with the scent of blossoms, the sun warm on her face. She found a spot beneath a blossoming cherry tree, a tree she had planted years ago, in memory of James, and carefully placed the dried blossom among the roots. It was a symbolic gesture, a final farewell, a letting go of the past, an embrace of the future. She had lived a long life, a life filled with both joy and sorrow, with love and loss, with challenges and triumphs. She had faced her demons, she had conquered her fears, she had found her strength. As she stood there, beneath the cherry blossoms, the wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the echoes of a promise, the memory of a love, the enduring spirit of a woman who had found her way through the darkness, who had emerged from the shadows, who had embraced the light. The river had returned the ring, and she, at last, had found herself. The end.